Moscow, Idaho, November 13th, 2022, 2:30 in the morning. The kind of quiet that only exists in small college towns, where the last bar is closed, the last laugh is faded, and the streets belong to nobody. But not tonight. Tonight, something was moving through that silence. 1122 King Road, a 3-story off-campus rental that the neighbors called the Happy House. And they meant it, because if you walked past that place on any given evening, you'd hear it. Music drifting from the windows, laughter bouncing off the walls, the sound of 4 young people living their lives with absolutely no idea that those lives were running out of time. Kaylee, Maddie, Xana, Ethan, for names you're about to know, for people who deserve so much more than what happened to them before the sun came up that morning. Now, I'm not going to tell you what happened yet, because before we get there, before we walk into that house, I need you to understand who was standing outside it, watching it, studying it, for months. A shadow that didn't look like a shadow at all. He looked like a graduate student, because he was one. A PhD candidate in criminology, a man who spent his days in university classrooms, teaching others how killers think, how predators choose their victims, how investigators catch the ones who believe they're too smart to be caught. His name is Bryan Kohberger. And the most chilling part of this entire story isn't just what he did. It's what he thought he knew. He studied the science of murder with the cold precision of a surgeon. He believed, genuinely believed, that his knowledge made him untouchable. He was wrong. Fast forward to 2026. Bryan Kohberger is 31 years old. He wakes up every single morning in a 7 by 12-foot concrete cell at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution. The furniture is bolted to floor. His meals are pushed through a slot in the door. He spends 23 hours a day staring at the same 4 walls, with nothing to do but think. And the 1 hour he gets outside, it's inside a fenced concrete cage that looks less like a yard and more like a place where hope comes to die. The man who made himself an expert on criminal psychology is now the case study. And here's the question this entire story is going to answer. The question that's been debated by legal experts, victims' families, and criminologists since the sentencing. Is what Bryan Kohberger is living through right now actually worse than the death penalty he bargained his way out of? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll have your answer. And before we go any further, if you believe Kaylee, Maddie, Xana, and Ethan deserve to have her story told, not just Bryan Kohberger's, hit that subscribe button right now. Because on this channel, the victims are never an afterthought. The trolls won't subscribe, but I think you will. Every story has a before, a time when the people in it were just living, laughing, making plans, dreaming out loud about everything that was still ahead of them. This is that part of the story. And I need you to stay here with me for a moment, because what comes later only matters if you first understand what was lost. 1122. King Road wasn't just a rental house. To the people inside it, it was home. It was a kind of place where the door was always unlocked for the right people, where someone was always cooking something, where the couch had permanent dents from too many movie nights. The neighbors didn't call it the Happy House as a figure of speech. They called it that because you could feel it when you walked past. And at the center of that happiness were 4 people who lit up every room they walked into. Let's start with Kaylee and Maddie, because their story didn't begin at King Road. It began years before that in Coeur d'Alene, where 2 little girls decided they were going to be best friends, and then simply never stopped. Kaylee Goncalves was 21 years old, a senior, an Alpha Phi sister, the kind of person who walked into a room and immediately became the energy of it. Fierce, funny, protective of the people she loved. She had already secured an IT job waiting for her in Texas. Her whole future mapped out, her bags practically half-packed. This weekend at King Road was supposed to be her farewell. One last weekend with her people before the next chapter began. She never made it to Texas. Madison Mogan Maddie was everything Kaylee's fire needed to stay grounded. A marketing major, a Pi Beta Phi sister. She worked at the Mad Greek restaurant downtown, and by every account, she was the emotional anchor of their friend group, the one who remembered birthdays, the one who checked in, the one who made sure nobody felt left out. Kaylee and Maddie had been side by side for so long, that people who knew them said it was almost impossible to picture one without the other. On the night of November 12th, they fell asleep in the same bed, just like they'd done 100 times before. Then there was Xana and Ethan. Xana Kernodle was 20 years old, a junior marketing major from Arizona, with the kind of personality that made strangers feel like old friends within minutes. People who knew her used the word sunbeam, and that wasn't poetic exaggeration. That was just Xana. Ethan Chapin was also 20, a Sigma Chi brother from Conway, Washington, and one of three, a triplet, which meant somewhere out there, two people woke up every morning after November 13th, carrying the shape of a brother-sized hole that would never close. Ethan wasn't even supposed to be at King Road that night. He came because Xana was there. That's what love does. It pulls you toward the people who matter most. For young people. For futures. For flames burning at full brightness. And that night, none of them knew that for months, a shadow had been watching their house, circling it, studying it, choosing them. Every monster has a beginning, and Bryan Kohberger's beginning looked, on the surface, almost painfully ordinary. He was born on November 21st, 1994, in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania, a quiet region, a quiet family, a quiet boy, who, from very early on, seemed to exist just slightly outside of everything happening around him. In school, Kohberger was a kid nobody quite connected with. Overweight, socially awkward, and acutely aware of both. He wasn't just unpopular. He was the kind of invisible that hurts. The kind where you sit in a room full of people and still feel completely alone. Former classmates would later describe him as someone who always seemed to be watching, more observer than participant, more analyst than friend. But then something shifted. In his late teens, Kohberger underwent what could only be described as a deliberate reinvention. He lost nearly 100 pounds, not gradually, but with the kind of rigid, obsessive discipline that doesn't come from a desire to be healthy. It comes from a need for control. During the same window, according to people close to him, he briefly fell into heroin use, a chapter he seemingly erased from his identity as cleanly as he shed the weight. He didn't just change his body. He rebuilt himself from the ground up, and whatever version of Bryan Kohberger emerged from that process, it was colder, more calculated, more convinced of his own superiority. But there was something else. Something most people covering this story completely overlook. Since his teenage years, Kohberger suffered from a rare neurological condition called visual snow syndrome. Imagine looking at the world through a screen that never stops buffering, a permanent layer of visual static clouding everything you see. Add to that a constant ringing in the ears, and what you have is a man who never once experienced silence. Not real silence. Not even in sleep. He once wrote about it himself on an online forum, and the words he used are worth sitting with for a moment. It is as if the ringing in my ears and the fuzz in my vision is simply all the demons in my head mocking me. Demons in his head. His words. Not ours. Psychologists who have reviewed his profile suggest this chronic sensory disruption deepened his emotional detachment, widening the gap between how he experienced the world and how everyone else did. It didn't make him a killer, but it made him someone who had long since stopped feeling fully present in the world around him. And a man who feels disconnected from the world finds it easier to do disconnected things. By the time Kohberger arrived at Washington State University in Pullman as a PhD student in criminology, he had constructed an identity he clearly believed was airtight: the reformed outsider, the serious academic, the man who had figured himself out. But his colleagues weren't convinced. Among his peers, Kohberger was a pariah, socially rigid, intellectually arrogant. He had a habit of dominating conversations and dismissing anyone he deemed less intelligent, which, in his estimation, was nearly everyone. Female students in particular filed complaint about his behavior, describing him as aggressive, condescending, and deeply uncomfortable to be around. By December 2022, just weeks after the night at King Road, he was formally terminated from his teaching assistant position. But here's what makes Bryan Kohberger different from the average case study. He wasn't just drawn to criminology the way some troubled people are drawn to dark subjects. He was using it, dissecting academic research on how predators select victims, studying the patterns, taking notes, not to understand monsters from the outside, but to refine something he was quietly building within himself. He wasn't studying the subject. He was the subject. And less than 15 minutes from his university office, across a state line, down a quiet road, sat a 3-story house with string lights in the window. A happy house that he had already been watching. Let's go back to that night. Not to the laughter, not to the warmth. That's behind us now. This time, we go to the dark part. By the time most of Moscow, Idaho was deep in sleep. A white Hyundai Elantra was already moving through the streets near King Road. Slowly, deliberately, this wasn't the first time it had been here. Surveillance records would later reveal that Kohberger had visited the area around the house 12 times in the months leading up to this night, studying the layout, the routines, the rhythms of the people inside. He didn't stumble into this. He planned it. At 3:29 a.m., cameras captured the Hyundai making its first pass, then a second, then a third, then a fourth at 4:20 a.m. Nearly an hour of circling, nearly an hour of waiting, of watching the windows, of confirming that the house was exactly where he needed it to be. And then the car stopped. What happened inside 1122 King Road in the window that followed is something prosecutors described as swift, calculated, and, in the language of forensic reports, targeted. Kohberger entered through the back of the house. He moved to the lower floors, past the rooms of 2 surviving roommates who were home that night, and heard nothing that pulled him out of sleep in time to change what was unfolding just feet away from them. Let that sit for a moment. 2 people, same house, same night. They survived, and they will carry the weight of that survival for the rest of their lives. On the second floor, Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin were together. Forensic findings paint a picture of a young woman who did not go quietly. Xana sustained injuries consistent with a fierce, desperate struggle. Deep defensive wounds on her hands, telling the story of someone who fought with every last thing she had. Ethan, the young man who came that night simply because the person he loved was there, was taken alongside her. On the third floor, Kaylee and Maddie, the 2 best friends who had been inseparable since childhood, were found together. Forensic analysis revealed the extreme intensity of the assault, with both young women sustaining a severe number of wounds. The concentration of injuries led experts to one clinical conclusion: overkill, a level of violence that goes beyond necessity, driven by something far deeper than logic. Kaylee had a job waiting in Texas. Maddie was supposed to open the restaurant that morning. Xana fought like her life depended on it. Because it did. Ethan just loved somebody. By the time daylight crept over King Road on November 13th, 2022, the house was silent in a way it had never been before. No music, no laughter, no footsteps on the stairs. Just the kind of quiet that doesn't feel like peace. It feels like an absence. And when the world finally woke up to what had happened inside that happy house, everything changed. Here's the thing about men who believe they're the smartest person in the room. They always leave something behind. Investigators combing through 1122, King Road found it almost immediately. A tan leather knife sheath, left behind on Maddie Mogan's bed. Small, easy to miss in the chaos of a rushed exit, but impossible to ignore under the cold light of a forensics lab. On the snap of that sheath, a single source of male DNA. One person's. Uncontaminated. Clean. For Kohberger, the man who had studied exactly how investigators build cases, it was a catastrophic oversight, the equivalent of a surgeon leaving an instrument inside a patient and sewing them up anyway. Investigators took that DNA and fed it into the same genetic genealogy technology that dismantled the Golden State Killer case. If you don't know that story, this technology doesn't just search for your DNA. It searches for your families. It casts a net so wide it can identify a suspect through a distant relative who once uploaded their profile to a public ancestry database. And that's exactly what happened. Investigators traced the DNA profile to Kohberger's father and then confirmed it the old-fashioned way. They went through the family's trash in Pennsylvania. Discarded DNA. No warrant required. Just patience, precision, and the kind of investigative instinct that Kohberger, for all his academic study, never truly respected. The net was closing, and he had no idea. Then came the digital trail. Kohberger had been careful about his phone on the night of the attack. switching it off to avoid real-time location tracking. What he failed to account for was everything before that night. Investigators reconstructed months of cell data showing he had been in the vicinity of King Road 12 times prior to November 13th. 12 visits, 12 data points, 12 nails in a case he thought was airtight, and the 4 slow circles his white Hyundai made around the house that night, caught on camera, time-stamped, irrefutable. The man who wrote academic papers on how predators avoid detection was detected by the very methods he had studied. On December 30th, 2022, just 47 days after the night at King Road, Bryan Kohberger was arrested at his parents' home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. He offered no resistance. The shadow that had moved so confidently through Moscow, Idaho, was standing in handcuffs in his parents' driveway. The perfect crime, unraveled by a knife sheath, a trash bag, and a digital footprint he was too arrogant to erase. July 2nd, 2025, 2.5 years after the night at King Road, Bryan Kohberger finally spoke the words that the families of 4 had been waiting to hear. Guilty, not because he felt remorse, not because the weight of what he had done had finally broken through whatever wall existed between him and human feeling. He said it because it was a transaction. In Idaho, the death penalty isn't theoretical. It is carried out by lethal injection, or, if the state chooses, by firing squad. Kohberger's legal team understood exactly what a trial risked, so they made the calculation that men like Kohberger always make, the one that prioritizes self-preservation above everything else, above accountability, above the families sitting rows behind him who had spent 2 years rebuilding themselves around a grief that never fully sets. He traded the possibility of death for the certainty of 4 walls, and he did it without flinching. July 23rd, 2025, sentencing day. One by one, the people whose lives Kohberger had permanently fractured stood up and faced him. They spoke directly to him, into the hollow space where a conscience should have been. Dylan Mortensen, one of the surviving roommates from King Road, stood before the court and called him exactly what the evidence had proven him to be, a soulless monster. Around her, the families wept. Some gripped photographs of Kaylee, Maddie, Xana, and Ethan, as if holding their images close enough could somehow fill the space those 4 had left behind. And Kohberger? He stared ahead, blank, empty, unmoved, not a tremor, not a swallow, not a single flicker of anything resembling acknowledgement that the people behind him were drowning in pain he had caused. For consecutive life sentences, no possibility of parole, the judge's gavel came down. And Bryan Kohberger's life, as he had known it, ended, not with a firing squad, not with a needle, with 4 words typed onto a legal document. No release. Ever. Justice had been delivered. But for the families of the Idaho 4, justice and healing are not the same thing. They never are. That sound you just heard, that door closing in the courtroom? In Bryan Kohberger's world now, that sound never stops. Welcome to the Idaho Maximum Security Institution. Kuna, Idaho. This is where Bryan Kohberger lives now. Not exists. Not survives. Lives. Every single day. For the next 50 years. He is housed in J Block, the Intensive Management Unit, the section of IMSI reserved for the inmates considered most dangerous, most volatile, or most in need of permanent separation from the general population. It is not a punishment within the prison. It is the prison. His cell measures 7 feet by 12 feet. Stand up right now and try to picture that. 7 feet wide, 12 feet long. That is the entire perimeter of Bryan Kohberger's world. Inside it, a bed bolted to the wall, a desk bolted to the wall, and a stool bolted to the floor. Nothing moves. Nothing can be rearranged. Nothing can be controlled. For a man whose entire identity was built around control, that is not a coincidence. That is the design. Meals arrive 3 times a day through a narrow slot in the door called a cuff port. There is no dining hall, no table, no conversation over food, just a tray appearing through a hole in the wall and disappearing the same way. He has no physical contact with other inmates. His 1 hour outside the cell each day is spent in a concrete recreation enclosure surrounded by chain link fencing. No grass, no open space, just a slightly larger box, where the sky is visible but entirely out of reach. 23 hours in the cell, 1 hour in the cage, then repeat, every day, for decades. And here's the moment, the detail that stops everyone cold when they truly sit with it. Bryan Kohberger spent years obsessively studying the psychology of criminal minds. He read the research. He taught the material. He dissected, academically, exactly how predators think, how isolation affects behavior, how prolonged confinement reshapes the human mind. He wrote papers on this. And now, in a room too small to pace properly, he has nothing to do but think. No research to conduct. No classroom to command. No identity to perform. Just a static. That same visual snow that has haunted him since his teenage years. And the silence of a corridor where no one is coming. In late 2025, Kohberger was reported to be among approximately 90 inmates at IMSI who participated in a hunger strike, protesting what they described as inhumane delays in medical care and the psychological toll of long-term solitary-style confinement. Think about that. The man who showed zero remorse in a courtroom full of grieving families, who stared blankly ahead while survivors called him a soulless monster, was protesting his own psychological suffering. Experts who study long-term maximum security confinement have a phrase for what Kohberger is experiencing. They call it a living death, not metaphorically. Clinically, the research shows that years of near-total isolation rewire the brain, eroding the capacity for normal thought, social connection, and eventually a stable sense of self. At 31 years old, Bryan Kohberger has approximately 50 more years of this ahead of him. The victim's flames were taken far too soon. His light isn't being extinguished. It's being left on in a room he can never leave. So, let's return to the question that started all of this. Is what Bryan Kohberger is living through right now, that 7 by 12 concrete cell, that cuff port, that 1 hour in a cage, actually worse than the death penalty he bargained his way out of? Here's what I think. Kaylee Goncalves had a job waiting in Texas, a whole future already in motion. She was supposed to be starting her next chapter, not ending her last one. Maddie Mogan was supposed to open the Mad Greek that morning. She was the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday, and now the people who love her have to figure out how to get through hers. Xana Kernodle fought, with everything she had. Her hands told that story long after she couldn't tell it herself. She deserved to win that fight. And Ethan Chapin, who came that night simply because the person he loved was there, left behind 2 siblings who wake up every single morning as one of 3 instead of 3 of 3. That math never balances. It never will. These 4 are remembered, celebrated, spoken about. Their names are known. Bryan Kohberger is being erased, slowly, by silence and concrete and 50 years of anonymity dressed up as consequence. No classroom, no audience, no control, just the static and the walls and the weight of what he chose. Worse than death? You decide. And if the story moved you, if you believe that Kaylee, Maddie, Xana, and Ethan deserve to be more than a headline, then do one thing before you leave. Subscribe. Share this video. Leave a comment with the words for flames so the algorithm knows the story matters. Because the only people who won't engage are the ones who've already forgotten these 4 existed. And I don't think that's you.